Cybertron has been invaded, poisoned, bombed, drained, occupied, and nearly consumed by a god. These are every apocalyptic threat it has survived. Ranked from the ones, history forgot to the one that nearly worked completely. Let's break this down. The Rust Plague. It destroyed everything made of metal. The Rust Plague was a contagion that spread through physical contact with infected materials, and the specific horror of its mechanism was that on a planet populated entirely by metal-based life forms living on a metal world, there was no environment the disease could not theoretically reach. Cybertron's golden age of expansion, the 800,000-year era during which the planet established itself as a galactic superpower, colonizing distant worlds, developing space bridge technology, achieving a level of civilizational reach that no other known species had matched, ended when a single exploration ship encountered the plague and carried it back through the colonial network. Sentinel Prime's response was to order the space bridges destroyed to prevent further spread, which severed the colonies from Cybertron permanently and stranded millions of Cybertronians on worlds they could not leave. The colonies survived. The connections that had made them part of the civilization did not. The Rust Plague never reached Cybertron's surface in sufficient concentration to destroy the planet, which is the only reason it sits at the bottom of this list rather than higher. It was catastrophic in scale, but limited in its ultimate reach. What it produced was the social fragmentation that preceded the Great War, the disconnection between the homeworld and its colonies that created the political conditions Megatron eventually exploited. The plague that started as a biological event became the precondition for everything that followed it, the Quintesson occupation. They told the Cybertronians they were their creators. The Quintessons arrived after the Great Cataclysm had left Cybertron's early population in a state of tribal conflict with no stable political infrastructure and no reason to distrust beings whose technology exceeded anything the nascent civilization had developed. The deception was total and immediate. The Quintessons presented themselves as the creators of the Cybertronian race, used that claimed authority to demand compliance, imposed a judicial system in which defendants were executed regardless of verdict, and transformed an entire species from a feuding tribal world into an advanced spacefaring civilization overnight in the most calculated possible way. The technology they provided was genuine, the advancement was real, and the subjugation those gifts purchased was the entire point. The Cybertronians thanked them for it. By the time the occupation's nature became clear enough to generate organized resistance, the Quintessons had been accepted as authority figures long enough that the rebellion required overcoming both the external power structure and the internal assumption that the power structure had a legitimate claim. When the rebellion eventually succeeded and the Quintessons were expelled, they left behind their ships, their space bridge blueprints, and a population that had been told a foundational lie about its own origin for long enough that the aftermath of learning the truth required processing across multiple subsequent civilizational eras. The occupation did not destroy Cybertron. It built a version of Cybertron on a false foundation and left the demolition of that foundation to the Cybertronians themselves. The Great Cataclysm. It happened before anyone had names for it. The Great Cataclysm is the franchise's term for the earliest catastrophic conflict in Cybertronian history, the period immediately following Primus's merger with Cybertron's core and his use of the Allspark to populate the planet, when the newborn Cybertronian population with no cultural infrastructure, no established governance, and no framework for processing the fact of their own existence encountered each other and immediately began destroying each other. The specific mechanisms of the cataclysm vary across continuities, but the structural description is consistent. A species that had been given life without being given the context for what to do with it produced its first civilizational event, and that event was catastrophic. It destroyed much of the primitive civilization, reduced the population significantly, and left Cybertron in the depleted, fragmented state that made the Quintesson occupation possible immediately afterward. The Cataclysm predates the factional divisions that the franchise subsequently built its war around, which means it predates the vocabulary the franchise uses to discuss conflict. There were no Autobots and Decepticons. There were newly alive beings who had the full capability of Cybertronian biology, and none of the judgment required to use it carefully. The Great Cataclysm is the franchise's honest acknowledgement that the civilizational failures the war represents were not introduced by Megatron or enabled by systemic corruption. They were present in the first hours of the species' existence, waiting for the population density to make them operational. Megatron's Dark Energon core poisoning. He did not invade Cybertron with an army. He infected it with one substance through one access point, and the result made the planet uninhabitable for every living Cybertronian who had not already evacuated. During the Great War of the Aligned Continuities timeline, Megatron pumped Dark Energon, Unicron's blood, the anti-spark that inverts the life-giving properties of standard Energon, directly into Cybertron's core. The franchise was specific about what this achieved. The planet itself, whose core was Primus and whose Energon supply was Primus's blood, became infected at the level of its fundamental biology. Dark Energon spreading through the Energon conduits that ran through Cybertron's surface was equivalent to a disease spreading through a vascular system. The surface became hostile. The atmosphere became poisoned. The planet that had been the Cybertronian civilization's home for millions of years needed to be evacuated and left to heal itself for an indeterminate period before it could support life again. Both factions left. The Allspark was sent into deep space for protection. Cybertron sat empty and corrupted, while the war that had poisoned it continued elsewhere. The recovery eventually came through the Omega Lock cyberforming function and Optimus Prime's final sacrifice, returning the Allspark to the Well of Allsparks, but the poisoning had required both of those events to undo what a single decision by Megatron had caused. He damaged the body of a god by injecting it with the blood of that god's enemy. The planet's convalescence lasted longer than most civilizations exist. Thunderwing and the Underbase. The IDW comics gave Cybertron a wound that took millennia to heal and was caused not by an invasion, but by a Decepticon experiment that succeeded. Thunderwing was a Decepticon theoretician who believed the war could be won through the Underbase, an enormous repository of ancient Cybertronian knowledge and power that predated the Great War, accessible through specific research protocols that required the researcher to integrate with the Underbase directly. The integration destroyed his personality and produced a being of enormous destructive capability with no governing intelligence to direct that capability. The G1 Marvel Comics showed him as an essentially unstoppable force that both Autobots and Decepticons eventually had to work together to contain rather than defeat. In the IDW continuity, the aftermath of Thunderwing's rampage was a specific mechanism that made Cybertron's surface uninhabitable. The Energon-destroying polarity treatments deployed to stop him had left the planet so chemically compromised that returning to it was medically impossible for any Cybertronian. Both factions had been driven off-world. The war continued on other planets, while Cybertron sat behind them as a monument to what one successful experiment had produced. Bludgeon eventually recovered Thunderwing's body and reactivated it in the IDW arc, which established that the threat Thunderwing represented had not been resolved but merely paused. The planet's contamination was the Scars experiment left on the world where the experiment was conducted. The transorganic dweller. It was sealed beneath Cybertron's surface because no one knew what else to do with it. The transorganics were creatures engineered before the Great War as biological weapons, living entities rather than mechanical constructs, which made them anomalies on a world of metal beings and gave them specific vulnerabilities and capabilities that conventional Cybertronian weapons could not address cleanly. The Dweller was the most dangerous of them, a creature designed to consume Energon at industrial scale, which in practice meant a creature designed to drain every Energon-dependent system it encountered, which on Cybertron meant a creature designed to kill every transformer it came into contact with by draining the fuel that kept their sparks running. The Quintessons eventually manipulated the Decepticons into releasing it from its containment during the G1 Season 3 era, and the Dweller's subsequent rampage across Cybertron's surface killed or incapacitated Transformers across the areas it moved through before the Autobots managed to launch it into space. The word manage in that summary is the key. They did not defeat it, did not destroy it, did not neutralize the threat. They launched it away from Cybertron because that was the best available option against something they could not kill. The Dweller is Cybertron's forgotten apocalypse, specifically because the resolution was not a victory, but a delay, and because space is very large and the Dweller was not destroyed. It was simply somewhere else. Shockwave's Regenesis plan. He spent 12 million years preparing to use Cybertron as bait. The IDW Comics' Shockwave operated across a timeline longer than most fictional villains have existed as characters, building toward a plan so patient and so structurally complete that even discovering it required knowing where to look across multiple planets and multiple eras of history simultaneously. The Regionesis program seeded planets across the galaxy with experimental energon ores, each one designed to mature over geological time into a refined variant. The seeded planets were the resources. Cybertron was the endpoint. When Unicron inevitably arrived to consume the planets that had been seeded, drawn by the concentrated energon that Shockwave had been cultivating for him across millions of years, the plan required him to eventually reach Cybertron, whose energon supply had been specifically corrupted with a talisman-like substance that would poison Unicron from the inside when he consumed it. Shockwave intended to destroy Unicron by feeding him a poison planet. The planet in question was home to the entire Cybertronian civilization. He had calculated the population as an acceptable variable in a plan designed to eliminate a being that no conventional force could address. The plan failed in the IDW continuity's execution because Unicron's consciousness was partially guided by an absorbed Antillan spirit whose vengeance exceeded Shockwave's predictive modeling. 12 million years of preparation, and the variable that broke the plan was the emotional state of something Unicron had consumed centuries before Shockwave began his first calculation: the Great War. It lasted millions of years and killed the planet before either side won. The Great War between Autobots and Decepticons is the franchise's central conflict across every continuity, and its apocalyptic dimension is not any single battle or strategic deployment, but the accumulated effect of two factions conducting total warfare on a planet whose resources were finite. Cybertron's energon supply, the blood of Primus, the fuel that every Cybertronian body required to function, and that the planet's infrastructure ran on, was consumed by the war at a rate that the planet could not regenerate. In the aligned continuity, the energon depletion drove both populations into underground tunnels and eventually forced civilizational evacuation. In the G1 continuity, the resource shortage that sent the Ark on its original mission, the mission that produced the crash on prehistoric Earth and everything the franchise subsequently built from it, was itself a consequence of the war's consumption rate. The Great War did not destroy Cybertron through a single decisive moment. It drained it. Millions of years of two factions drawing from the same finite planetary resource produced the slow civilizational collapse that looked from inside it like a permanent state of conflict and felt from outside it, looking back, like a species burning its own home to determine who owned it. Both factions eventually left Cybertron not because either had won, but because there was no longer enough of Cybertron to fight over: the 1986 Unicron attack. He ate the moons first. In the opening act of the G1 cartoon's most consequential sequence, Unicron arrived in Cybertron's solar system and consumed Cybertron's moons before turning his attention to the planet itself. The moons were populated. Autobots stationed on Moonbase 1 and Moonbase 2 were inside Unicron when he swallowed them, their last transmissions cutting off as the mechanical digestive environment of a planet-sized chaos god began processing everything inside. Unicron then began physically dismantling Cybertron, his massive mechanical hands reaching into the planet's surface and tearing pieces away, his internal systems consuming the material while the remaining Cybertronian population watched their world being eaten from the outside. The matrix of leadership stopping the process required Hot Rod to become Rodimus Prime in Unicron's interior and open the artifact, releasing the light of Primus's concentrated life force against the being that life force was specifically anathema to. Unicron exploded. Cybertron survived. The Matrix was spent. The franchise spent subsequent seasons processing what the survival cost: Vector Sigma destabilizing without the Matrix as a controlling force, the Headmaster's era's Cybertron destruction storyline, the cascading consequences of a planet that survived its most devastating attack in a significantly weakened state. The 1986 attack was stopped. Its aftermath ran through every Transformers story produced in the following decade, which is the most accurate measurement of how close the stop actually was. Megatron's Vehicon occupation/Beast Machines. He won. In the Beast Machines continuity, Megatron did not attempt to conquer Cybertron. He succeeded completely before Optimus Primal and his surviving Maximals returned to discover what success looked like. The planet they came back to was operationally intact and experientially empty. Megatron had used a virus to strip every Cybertronian on Cybertron of their sparks, separating consciousness from body across the entire population simultaneously. The bodies continued moving, converted into Vehicon drones that followed Megatron's commands without the self-awareness that had made them individuals. The Sparks were imprisoned, held in Megatron's possession, removable from their owners at will, the entire population of a planet reduced to either mindless drones or captured consciousness waiting for a body to return to. It was not an invasion that killed people. It was an occupation that made people into tools while keeping them technically alive, which the franchise treated as specifically worse. Optimus Primal's team spent the entire series attempting to restore something that Megatron had already successfully dismantled before the season premiere. He had not tried to destroy Cybertron. He had converted it into exactly what he wanted, a world where every being on it was his instrument, every body was his resource, and the concept of an individual Cybertronian with their own will and their own spark and their own relationship to Primus had been administratively discontinued. It was the most complete victory any villain achieved against Cybertron in franchise history. The only reason it was reversed was that 5 Maximals escaped by accident.